The U.S. on the world stage as Secretary of State Mike Pompeo travels to Abu Dhabi following ambivalent meetings with North Korean officials in Pyongyang. This ahead of President Trump's trip to Brussels this week for the NATO summit, where the focus will be on getting Europe to meet the U.S. halfway on defense spending. Joining us right now is Robert Jordan. He is former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia, currently a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He's also author of Desert Diplomat. Ambassador, it's good to see you this morning. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Maria.
Big focus on what the president will say to his NATO colleagues. He's targeting NATO for placing unfair burdens on the United States in terms of the U.S.'s defense spending. Yesterday, U.S. Ambassador to Germany Rick Grenell was on Sunday Morning Futures admitting that Germany is just not paying enough. Watch this.
It's a very pro-Europe position to ask countries in Europe, specifically Germany, to increase their defense spending. This is going to create a stronger transatlantic alliance. This is very pro-Europe, and currently the Germans don't spend enough.
What do you say about that, Ambassador?
Well, I think he's probably right. The Germans don't spend enough. I think we've seen some incremental commitments from Chancellor Merkel to improve that spending. But I think there's an accounting that needs to be rendered here. At the same time, I think we've got to maintain our diplomatic posture, which is these are allies. They're not enemies. We need a better deal from the allies, but we don't need to sacrifice the alliance in the process.
So not sacrificing the alliance in the process, how do you do that and get your colleagues to pay up their fair share in terms of what they spend on defense?
We've got a very good ambassador to NATO right now, Kay Bailey Hutchison, and I think she is going to find a way to communicate with the Germans and the other members of NATO. I think we've got to do it incrementally. We can't expect them to change their posture overnight. And they have their own political and cultural issues that they have to deal with domestically. I think we need to remember that. She can't snap her fingers and say we're going to double our defense spending. Some of the other NATO members have also committed to increases. I think this is positive, and we need to have a certain amount of diplomatic patience as we go forward. But definitely they need to step up their game and pay a larger share of the cost.
So what are you expecting from this trip? The president, of course, tonight will announce his Supreme Court pick to replace Justice Kennedy, and then he will head to Brussels for the NATO summit before, of course, ending the trip in Helsinki with a meeting with Vladimir Putin on the 16th.
Well, there are a lot of moving parts to this, and so I think you can parse it out. The meeting with Kim, of course, is extremely important in terms of Secretary Pompeo's visit. The meeting with Putin is extremely important in terms of President Trump's visit. We're going to see, I think, some conditional promises. I think we'll see some conditional commitments from the NATO allies at the NATO meeting. I think Secretary Pompeo in Abu Dhabi is going to work heavily on isolating Iran and making sure that we have firm commitments to not purchase Iranian oil the best we can. So there really will be a lot of balls in the air, I think, over the next week to 10 days.
Yeah, and the president told me just last week that he has no problem putting sanctions on European companies should they do business with Iran. Meanwhile, we're all awaiting North Korean news. Chairman Kim's decision to denuclearize the rogue regime, blaming the United States for its, quote, gangster tactics that are throwing negotiations off the table. Here's the message Secretary Pompeo issued yesterday. Listen to this, sir.
The choice now lies with North Korea and its people. If they're able to do this, they will be remembered, and Chairman Kim will be remembered as a hero of the Korean people.
We're trying to figure out, Ambassador, how well or not well this meeting went. Secretary Pompeo said his talks with North Korea were productive, but the North seems to think otherwise. Is the country retreating back to the unhinged behavior? What's your take?
I think we're going to have a ping-pong effect here for a while, as Secretary Richardson just said. I think we're going to see some backtracking and then some advancement, some promises and some hedging. And this is typical North Korean behavior. Again, I think we have to have the diplomatic patience to see it through. And the real question, I think, will be how are they working together at a somewhat lower level, a more technical level, in terms of disclosure, in terms of potential remedies for the nuclear program. If they don't have their subordinates and their technical people working, then this is all just a charade.
Well, I mean, if they don't tell us in the next couple of weeks where their facilities are in terms of their nuclear and uranium enrichment, then we will know that they're just not serious about any of this. Is that a fair statement?
I think that's very likely. Then at the same time, we may walk away from the table, and then 6 months later they may say, well, you know, these sanctions are hurting us. Let's just see what we can do to put this back together. So there's a constant air of trying to make a deal, trying to get things together. But the North Koreans don't seem to be very serious right now about doing anything. What
does the U.S. want from Russia, Ambassador? I mean, next week, the president will meet with Vladimir Putin, a foe of the NATO alliance, by the way. They'll meet in Helsinki with a private meeting between the two leaders. Will Putin be the elephant in the room in Brussels? And what does the president really want at this point from Russia? What do you think the focus of the meeting will be?
Well, I think the president is going to want Russia, of course, to maximize their oil production right now. He's very concerned about the price of oil. Russia is capable of expanding production somewhat. I think he's going to want some understanding from Russia about what they intend to do on the eastern flanks of NATO. NATO has had a pretty aggressive eastward expansion, which, of course, has bothered Putin. So there's going to have to be some understanding of how far that's likely to go. I think the president may well raise the issue of interference in American elections, destabilizing our democracy, but I don't expect him to hit it as hard as probably his critics would like him to.
Well, of course, one of the key issues for the president with Putin is Iran's role in Syria. And Russia's role. Is the prospect of greater U.S.-Russian cooperation with Syria on the table, or do we not trust Vladimir Putin to actually partner with the U.S. as opposed to partnering with Syria?
Well, Russia has really punched above its weight in Syria, I'll have to say. For a minimal investment, they've got a foothold in the Mediterranean, they've got a foothold in Syria and the Middle East in a way that has really maximized their strategic options. I do think the president is going to want to find a way to cooperate with Russia on Syria, a way perhaps to acknowledge that Bashar al-Assad or his cohorts will continue to rule much of the country. But again, much of that country is also not going to be governed by the central government for quite a period of time. They may want to figure out ways to avoid the expansion of ISIS within Syria. There's a vacuum there that ISIS can continue to rebound and fill. And so I think they're going to have discussions along those lines. I don't expect any grand bargain to come from it, but I think they incrementally will try to see where, on the edges, they've got some common interests.
I mean, the issue of sanctions comes up all the time regarding Russia. Yeah. Any movement would you expect there?
Well, I think part of it depends on what the Russians' position continues to be with regard to Ukraine. If they continue to try to destabilize Ukraine, even after having seized Crimea, then I think the sanctions likely will continue. This is an area where I think it's going to be quite uncertain. We don't really know quite what to expect either from Putin or from President Trump in this regard.
How is the president doing in terms of foreign relations in general, in your view, right now?
Well, he's certainly taken a more America First position. I think it has endangered some of our traditional alliances. He was elected as a disruptive force, and I think he has proven to be such. At the same time, I think we've got some movement, perhaps, in terms of dealing with Iran, in terms of perhaps dealing with China in ways that are transactional, but I don't see a long-term strategic plan in terms of his overall approach to foreign policy. I would like to see a little more in terms of a consistent, rational foreign policy other than simply calling it America First.
All right. We will be watching that. Thank you so much, Ambassador. Good to see you, sir.